The Eleanor and Thomas P. Hackett Memorial Award is inspired by the life and career of Dr. Tom Hackett, who helped establish the Academy during its formative years. He led CL psychiatrists in firmly identifying the field as being in the heart of medicine.
There's a reason why the Hackett Award is the most preeminent award that the organization offers, because of Tom's great leadership in this. And he did it at a time when, again, as I say, there were forces in the field that were really rushing to demedicalize psychiatry in a way that would have been very, very dangerous and very bad for both training and clinical care.
Tom would come and he'd just be around. And if you had a problem or a unique issue, he would always listen to you and come up with some interesting answers. He was always humble.
Tom, during his lifetime and career, changed the lives of so many psychiatrists, especially CL psychiatrists, because he practiced the principle of being a physician first and a psychiatrist second.
His wife Ellie was a fixture at Academy meetings and developed the ways we honor Academy members for their service. The Hackett Award is therefore the Academy's highest honor, given to the individual whose concern for others, warmth, humor, and commitment to excellence best recalls Tom's and Ellie's vibrant spirits, whose gifts as a teacher, particularly at the bedside and in the outpatient clinic, are best characterized as inspiring, whose intellectual curiosity has generated innovative research at the interface of psychiatry and medicine, whose leadership, across a broad range of contributions, has advanced both the field of consultation-liaison psychiatry and the impact of the Academy. This year's award is given to another one of our profession's most talented and accomplished members.
Good afternoon. It is my distinct privilege to introduce the 2020 Hackett Awardee of the Academy of Consultation-Liaison Psychiatry, our colleague, mentor, and friend, Michael Bostwick. Michael is most deserving of this honor for his immeasurable contributions to the field of consultation-liaison psychiatry as an academician, educator, humanist, researcher, leader, and incisive intellect. Michael has a distinguished career of service to the Academy. He has presented more than 50 times at Academy meetings, more often than not to standing room only audiences, served as program chair on multiple committees, and as a two-term counselor. He is also a recipient of the Academy's Alan Studemeyer Award in recognition of his educational innovation and excellence. Michael's proverbial dance card is so full at Academy meetings that he is one of the presenters around whom the schedule of concurrent sessions must be planned to avoid double and even triple booking of his time. Throughout the Academy, he is known as, quote, a brilliant intellect and gentle soul, in the words of our Academy colleague, Madeline Becker. For the past more than 2 decades, Michael's home base has been at Mayo Clinic, where he serves in so many roles and has such wide-ranging impact that listing them all would eclipse the full time allotted for this introduction and his lecture. And there is so much more to Michael to say beyond his work. So here is the short version. Michael arrived at Mayo Clinic in 1998 after attending medical school at Brown, completing residency and fellowship at the Cambridge and Brigham and Women's Harvard Teaching Hospitals, and completing a successful military psychiatry career in the Air Force, mostly in Texas. He is legendary at Mayo and in the Rochester, Minnesota community. Colleague Alistair McCain sums it up by saying, quote, Michael is a gifted educator, wonderful collaborator, and unparalleled human being. Michael is a clinically active consultation liaison psychiatrist, serves as the Director of Medical Student Education in Psychiatry, the Senior Associate Dean for Admissions overseeing all 3 Mayo campuses, and has been Professor of Psychiatry for more than a decade. A beloved and revered teacher, Michael has formally mentored more than 50 students and trainees, in addition to the countless students and residents he has taught on his CL service. Many of his mentees are now leaders in CL psychiatry in their own right. His commitment to and unique aptitude for teaching and mentoring is evidence in the universal appraisal of his former students and trainees that Michael's influence for each of them has been professionally and personally transformative. and also sealed by his recognition as not only the best teacher in psychiatry at Mayo on multiple occasions, but also as Teacher of the Year for the entire medical school and recipient of the Distinguished Service Award to Mayo. Michael is a prolific researcher and writer on wide-ranging topics from the arts and humanities in psychiatry to the management of delirium and psychoactive effects of opiates and cannabis. He is world-renowned for his research on and unique contributions to understanding suicide, earning him lecturing and teaching invitations around the globe. In the rare circumstances in which Michael explicitly gives himself credit or recognition in the presence of others, he has said that his work on suicide has been the most important and meaningful to him professionally and personally, in light of the profound impact that losing his closest in age younger brother to suicide had on him when they were both teenagers. This pivotal loss during Michael's formative years has no doubt contributed centrally to who Michael has become. Michael is always present, forms lasting and meaningful connections to others in every aspect of his life, and stands firmly for what he believes. He has an uncanny ability to sit with others in their pain, to be a healing presence, and to live life to its fullest amidst adversity. Let me now tell you a little bit about how it all began and about Michael's life. Michael was, quote, born old, unquote, according to his mother, who said she knew he was smart because he had the memory of an elephant from at least the age of 2. Michael was an avid reader by the age of 4 and was always driven. Drawn to music at an early age, he saved up $100 from his paper route for a down payment on an upright Wurlitzer so he could play piano. Michael, the oldest of 4 siblings, was always a, quote, natural caretaker, according to his mother, and this role intensified after his brother's death. Michael's mother said that Michael always made sure that she and his siblings were okay and was always attuned to trying to lessen others' pain. This picture is from Michael's 1974 Phillips Academy yearbook. Michael's high school years at Andover fueled his intellect and were also emotionally challenging in the wake of the suicide. He went on to Yale, where he met his wife Connie in introductory biology class, passing her notes and his impeccable penmanship in between constructing his elaborate doodles in his composition books, a trait that persists to this day. He majored in art history and perhaps took this historiography to a bit of an extreme, in that he has reportedly saved in his attic every notebook and doodle that he's ever made. What's clear is that at this early age, Michael already had the capacity to be present and the staying power to lean in when others might not have been able to bear the discomfort or pain of a situation. For example, looking back, longtime friend Brian Sapp says that he probably wouldn't have survived freshman year at Yale without Michael, who was never too busy to listen. In retrospect, says Brian, quote, Michael probably practiced psychiatry on me before he even knew he wanted to be a psychiatrist. Lifelong friend Bob Bagnell also recalls that in his college years, Michael, quote, gave a lot of himself to many friends, often late into the night. It's easy to look back at that and say he was predestined or preparing himself to become a psychiatrist, but that may be purely a fallacy with the benefit of hindsight, Bob said. Though not a clear path towards medicine, the beginnings of Michael's many other passions were already in place. His ability to be present, his keen listening, his wild intellect, and his many honed interests. Rumor has it that Michael cultivated plants under special lights in his dorm room, avidly practiced clarinet, and would pull all-nighters, prolifically writing art history papers. After college, Michael worked for the Cape Cod Times for several years. He was likely influenced to become a physician by the medical careers of his maternal grandfather and great-grandfather, but no one specific formative experience stands out for family and friends about what led to Michael's decision to pursue medical school. His mother recalls that Michael approached the decision to go to medical school with the characteristic determination he brought to life more generally. Quote, anything he did, he was deadly serious about doing it right. Well, you already know the rest of that story. According to all who know him, Michael is a polymath and a Renaissance man, in a turtleneck, of course. Though typical of Michael, who never shies away from just a little low-level controversy, there is some debate about whether he is a modern or a postmodern Renaissance man. But let's leave that debate for another venue. Mayo colleague Phil Fisher describes Michael as, quote, a modern Renaissance man. He is a brilliant scientist with a world-class reputation. He is an academic leader. He is a creative thinker, and no box could contain, quote, all that is Michael. Michael is a world-class clarinetist, a connoisseur of fine music, a foodie of foodies, and an amazing collector with what might be the world's largest collection of toy ambulances. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of butterflies and flowers, with a detailed recall of all relevant genus and species and subspecies names. He has turned his backyard into an arboretum and his front yard into a thriving plot of prairie vegetation. He embodies the knowledge of a 19th century natural scientist with the 21st century knowledge of a physician fully dedicated to his patients and the next generation of physicians. Michael combines the humanities and the sciences and is a self-made expert in all, while coming from a military background and being an incredibly compassionate and caring clinician. Oh, and he's a great husband and father of twins. Michael's former choral director, Rick Pham, described Michael's love for music as running very deep. When Michael is singing, he is, quote, all in for the choral experience. One would not suspect that he is chairing the admissions committee of the medical school, leading the conversation in the state of Minnesota on cannabis policy, and writing and editing and reviewing who knows how many articles on who knows how many subjects, said Rick. In addition to perpetually perfecting his garden, Michael has designed and consulted on gardens that bloom in all seasons and knows all aspects of every plant, including for his friend Jerry Fox. He is an avid traveler and explorer and has visited every inhabited continent on the planet. He has even served as Justice of the Peace for a day to perform the wedding of his decades-long friend Alice Demner and her wife. And lest I forget to tell you, Michael is famous for his elaborate and joyous gourmet dinners and for making a mean baked Alaska. And oh, he does this all while most recently pursuing a low residency MFA at Bennington College. It's no wonder that Michael is also known for sometimes doing things a little bit at the last minute. Michael and Connie's generosity and fine dining are presided over by Michael with nonstop wit and barbs. He is just very funny. The picture on the left is from friend and colleague Mary Johnson's 50th birthday costume party, in which Michael is dressed as a Freudian slip. And on the right, a gourmet Easter meal was served by Michael wearing bunny ears to fit the occasion. Bob Bagnell, a friend of 50 years, characterizes Michael as being committed to and caring for others while not taking himself too seriously, a quality he's had since the very beginning. Perhaps this is how Michael, a Massachusetts native, nurtures his love of Dunkin' Donuts coffee amidst his appreciation of finer gourmet food and legendary magnificent dinners, both remembered by his then Air Force psychiatry colleague, John Campbell, who, also a Massachusetts native, would venture off base with Michael for a, quote, coffee regula. Michael always has a joke, and he rarely shies away from being just a little provocative. In the midst of the pandemic, for example, Michael asked if he could text me daily pornographic photos of the flowers in his garden, of course. Michael also speaks the truth. He is both very Mayo and very unconventional. Summed up by Mayo colleague John Davidson, quote, in 41 years of doctoring, I have not known or been gifted with a friend or colleague quite like Michael. He is a probing and healing clinician, a discriminant researcher, and at times a balding, bushy, red-bearded miscreant who speaks truth to the powers of the prim, if not quite proper, in the academe of our place. Chaplain colleague and friend Mary Johnson described Michael as, quote, never afraid to speak his mind and unconstrained by convention. Dan Hall-Flavin described him as the conscience of their department at Mayo, a strong voice to speak what he sees in a straightforward and unadulterated way. And finally, admissions colleague Amit Shah recognizes Michael for his amazing ability to get a group talking about tough issues. Perhaps because of his own history and his embracing of life in all its dimensions, Michael has an almost uncanny ability to be present and healing to others in their times of pain. Longtime friend and colleague Jim Rundell describes how Michael, quote, sees aspects of a situation everyone else misses and never loses sight of a patient's narrative. Alice Demner recalls that after her sister died, Michael called her and, quote, even though we hadn't spoken for a couple of years at that point, the phone conversation was as close and as comforting as if we'd been talking daily or weekly. It has been that way for over 44 years of friendship. No matter the lapses, we pick right up where we left off. And I know that I am not alone in treasuring that closeness. Quite indeed, nearly everyone has a story about Michael's presence at times of others' need. Former resident Kristen Schmidt described that what she, quote, learned best from Michael is how important it is to be present for those who have counted on absence. Colleague Marjan Holloway recalls the story of how she shared with Michael her own struggles in her journey to parenthood. Michael responded by talking about his own journey and, quote, encouraged me to dream on. Ultimately, when her son Aiden was born after 14 years of trying and 24 years of marriage, Michael sent Aiden the classic books Goodnight Moon and The Runaway Bunny, the latter labeled as, quote, required reading for mental health providers about good enough adaptive parenting. On parenting and family, Rochester friend Bart Seaback wrote of how Michael and Connie are loving and supportive parents of talented young adult twins, Hannah and Gabe, and how parenting, quote, has obviously shaped Michael as much as the kids. About family, Bart continued, quote, Connie, I observe, is an incredibly strong and supportive partner, extremely accomplished in her own medical career and engaged in her community. Indeed, we have all observed Michael's devotion to Connie, who has brought him light and love for more than 40 years, not for a second pausing or missing a step in together facing her health challenges. Mary Johnson recalls driving Michael home and having the car surrounded by a flock of intoxicated juvenile cedar waxwings, birds pictured here known for their dressed-up combs. The birds had just feasted on a fermented tree and were lollygagging in their drunkenness. For maybe 8 or 10 minutes, Mary and Michael sat silent and in awe. Mary says the moment captures Michael's ability to be present and that there is no one else she would have rather shared the magic with. Says our good friend Jim Rundell, Michael, quote, doesn't get in a hurry and doesn't know how to say no. But somehow this march to the beat of a different drummer gets him to the finish line. Yet Michael can be impatient when it comes to being an activist for the right and the good. He has been on the vanguard of promoting diversity at Mayo in all its dimensions. He talked about inclusion before anyone was talking about systemic exclusion. Dan Hall-Flavin said that he particularly appreciated Michael's advocacy on behalf of transgender persons in a characteristic, direct, yet elegant way. Our Academy colleague, Sandy Rackley, says of Michael that, quote, he was an anti-racist before it was even a recognized thing to be anti-racist. Never one to play nice or go along to get along, Michael is deeply respectful of and curious about difference. Each year, as the admissions dean for Mayo's Medical School, he successfully recruited ever higher proportions of underrepresented minorities in each entering class. He did this while also driving the committee to value all possible diversities in candidates and successfully advocating to increase financial aid to make it possible for students to come to Mayo. Mayo admissions colleague Gina Rassinen also values Michael's, quote, courage to be a disruptor as inspiring, particularly from within a highly conservative culture. He has the courage to bring an honest perspective to the table rather than one that is expected, she says. It is refreshing and invites transformative growth and progress. Finally, we all wish we could be here with Michael in person today. We are drawn to him and are his lifelong colleagues turned friends because of his humanity. Former Air Force colleague Bill Wisniewski summed up, quote, Michael's greatest talent is his humanity. The common element in each thing Michael does is service to others. He was like this in the Air Force and has not changed 20 plus years hence. Michael and Connie's generosity is legendary. They regularly open their home, and all touched by their warmth and welcome consider themselves the most fortunate, quote, family by choice. Says Cosima Swintak, quote, there is usually a motley crew with diverse dietary needs and restrictions, all of whom he manages to nourish with love, humor, and delicious food. As we draw to a close, former resident and now Mayo colleague Dion Hart wants Michael to know that she is wearing a hot pink turtleneck in honor of this day, and in line with the nickname that he has given her, D exclamation point, asks that we say congratulations exclamation point to Michael. Perhaps the greatest testament to Michael is the number of friends and colleagues who replied to my blind inquiries over the past just over 2 weeks to contribute to this introduction. I was helped, of course, by most of them blaming Michael for leaving this to the last minute and giving me so little time. But don't worry, Michael. I assured them I had learned how to do much with little time from you. I want to close with the words of Jim Rundell, who is, incidentally pictured here when Michael introduced him for the Hackett Award 8 years ago. And I give you this photo in order to provide concrete imagery of what this moment might look like without the interference of a global pandemic. We can hope, says Jim, that Michael continues to teach us all how, quote, to make the most of life in the face of challenges that would cause most people to just stay home. Please join me in saying congratulations, exclamation point, and in welcoming the incomparable Michael Bostwick as he gives his Hackett Award address. Thank you.
Hello. This is to let you know that I have no conflicts to disclose. The title of my talk today is Forks in the Road and Uses of the Self in Consultation-Liaison Psychiatry. It's surreal to be receiving this award, and even more surreal to be receiving it virtually. If I asked someone to pinch me to confirm this is actually happening, there would be no one to do it since I'm by myself as I tape this address, as I imagine most of you are listening to it. I fervently wish I will forever hold the singular distinction of being the only virtual Thomas and Eleanor Hackett Award winner, and that we will all be together again next November in Miami. Previous winners have typically started by describing how they knew Tom Hackett. For much of its history, this has been a 1 degree of separation award, because it seemed like so many of our senior leaders knew him one-on-one as teacher, colleague, friend, or all three. I didn't. I know Tom Hackett as an ideal, not a man, though if 1 degree of separation is someone who knew Tom, and 2 degrees is someone who knows someone who knew Tom, then I am richly endowed with second degreeness simply by belonging to this academy and learning from those who did know him. I can claim first degreeness with Ellie Hackett. During the annual meeting in Albuquerque in 2005, we shared a memorable meal involving a flourless chocolate cake called Boca Negra. Who knew that Ellie loved chocolate cake? I was even able to get the chef to give us the recipe. I believe I can claim the distinction of being a distant second only to Ellie in the number of times I've had the privilege of introducing Hackett Award winners. First, Jim Rundell, and second, Marianne Cohen. While preparing this talk, I've come to realize 2 principles that define how I've approached my career. The first is that when faced with the choice between 2 seemingly disparate alternatives, I hew to an axiom attributed to Yogi Berra. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. The second axiom is that I repeatedly use myself and events in my personal life to shape and inform directions I take and decisions I make. These are the Mayo Clinic 3 shields, which represent clinical practice, research, and education. And this is the ring I wear, whose 3 interlocking circlets represent another triad: my work, my family, and myself. I'm committed to the centrality of narrative in all aspects of consultation-liaison psychiatry. I intend the stories I tell you today to illustrate how these 2 principles, taking the fork in the road, and the use of self have guided me. I hope my tales will inspire younger colleagues and maybe even older ones to consider emulating my example, at least a little bit. I'm the oldest child in an Air Force family. Going back to at least the mid-1800s, both sides of my family have hailed from the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. My parents wanted to escape, go figure. They joined the Air Force. This is my father in his flight suit and my mother in a cashmere suit, sweater and pearls. My father was a career navigator who flew more than 10,000 hours in Cold War reconnaissance planes along both US coasts and hot war planes over Vietnam. This is an EC-121H, which for a while was Air Force One. And that thing in the middle of the fuselage is the radar dome. My mother was a dutiful military wife who created a home for us, whether in California, England, Ohio, or Massachusetts. I attended 9 schools before 9th grade, but the major influence on my career was not my father, but my mother's father, John Morris Ball, MD, for whom I am named. I never knew my grandpa John, and here he is circa 1926 in his graduation from medical school photo. He collapsed and died of a massive heart attack 2 years before I was born, just after taking a phone call from a patient a few minutes after midnight on the 4th of July. As the Academy is to Tom Hackett, so is my mother to her father. She idealizes him and she idolizes him. She idolizes him for being a physician. She idealizes him for having chosen to practice in a gritty inner city Cincinnati neighborhood. She raised me on anecdotes of his selfless care for German immigrants, working class people, and a convent of nuns, the Sisters of St. Leo, among others he treated for free. He was often paid in kind, including once with a French bulldog puppy. He brought the puppy home. My grandmother Leela said absolutely not. He went out on a house call. But when he returned home several hours later, Leela and the puppy, now named Pudgy, were asleep together in the easy chair. Pudgy kept my grandmother company for the next nearly 20 years. When my grandfather died, he left drawers full of unpaid invoices because he was too kind-hearted to dun patients he knew could barely rub 2 nickels together, let alone settle up with him. My mother will swear that she never professored me into becoming a doctor like her dad, to which I will simply respond that I always knew that my ultimate destiny was to make her proud and try to be half the physician her father was. There was this little problem, however. As a teenager, I was showing neither aptitude nor inclination for science, specifically courses of the pre-medical variety. My passions lay with the arts, first music, and later visual arts and writing. By college, my parents had divorced and my mother settled on Cape Cod, about as far as she could get from Ohio without crossing the pond to Europe. I was principal clarinetist in the All-State Orchestra my senior year. I was accepted to Eastman School of Music as a performance major. Summers through high school and college, I played keyboards and clarinet as a church musician. As a Yale undergrad, I studied clarinet in the School of Music and played in ensembles several hours each day. I tried to take both forks, humanities and science, but I bombed out of inorganic chemistry and didn't do so well in introductory biology either. By sophomore year, it seemed pretty clear this medicine thing was going to be a non-starter, Grandpa John or not. Meanwhile, I had signed up for a course in American Decorative Arts that featured dismantling colonial furniture, this is a Queen Anne highboy, to see how it was constructed, and drinking cider or beer from a 17th century silver tankard. I was smitten. I decided to major in art history with an emphasis on 19th century architecture and urban design. Great stuff, but what was I supposed to do with a BA in art history? One skill you can't avoid picking up majoring in liberal arts at Yale is how to write. After a false start as a senatorial intern in Washington, D.C., I returned home and started stringing at the Cape Cod Times, a daily newspaper. A few months later, I was hired as a staff writer covering the Falmouth Police and Fire Beat in the morning, the Cape Art Scene and Woodsole Scientific Institutions in the afternoon. The Red Star is Falmouth, where I was assigned and where I live and my mother still lives. I learned to think like a journalist, which meant learning as much as I could about things that interested me, and figuring out how to write about them in a way that was both accurate and interesting for my readers. No fake news. I have taken a journalistic approach to my academic career. I may have bombed out of chemistry, but my doctor dream had not exploded. In fashioning my own version of the now popular pre-med post-bac programs, and this was 40 years ago, I started out with a little exposure therapy. I volunteered in the emergency department at Yale New Haven Hospital, and later, while working as a reporter, I tried going back to school by taking an evening calculus course at a state college in Massachusetts. It went well. I also decided to move to Honolulu with two purposes in mind: to pursue pre-medical courses at the University of Hawaii, and to confirm or figure out that my long-term, long-distance college girlfriend, Connie Williams, now a University of Hawaii medical student, and I were going to stay together. I did the courses, and we stayed together, but being a fork taker, I couldn't just settle for being a pre-med. University of Hawaii, which was willing to let me earn another bachelor's degree, and I was game. So in 3 semesters, taking up to 21 credits at a time, I completed the pre-medical courses plus a zoology major with a focus on Hawaiian natural history. I wrote a prize-winning thesis on ecological threats to the koloa, the Hawaiian duck. I won $50 in the distinction of having my paper become a permanent part of the Hawaiiana collection in the University of Hawaii Library. Connie and I graduated at the same time in 1982. She with her MD degree, me with that second bachelor's degree. I love the color of my beard, by the way, then. We returned to the mainland so that she could start a family medicine residency in Worcester, and I returned to my newspaper job while applying to medical school. Brown accepted me without an interview, I kid you not, and I took an Air Force scholarship to pay for it. The next fork in the road was residency applications. After an 8-week child psychiatry elective between 3rd and 4th years, I thought I had found my future. This is the Emma Pendleton Bradley Hospital at Brown, and it has the distinction of being where Ritalin was used for the first time in the 1930s. I applied to the match in both pediatrics and adult psychiatry and matched to a categorical peds internship at Mass General and an adult psychiatry residency at Cambridge Hospital. So you see, I was actually at Mass General at the same time as Tom Hackett, but in a different department. I ended up postponing psychiatry and staying at MGH for a second peds year. I wasn't yet ready to give up the idea of being a real doctor. Sound familiar? Second year's pediatrics resident call consisted of hopping into an ambulance and heading out to hospitals all over New England with an experienced nurse, Mrs. Pat Beckles, who must have had ice water in her veins to be riding around with a junior resident to pick up dying children. Our goal was to stabilize critically ill newborns or children and transport them back to MGH's NICU or PICU. By the end of that year, I had started a collection of toy ambulances, now numbering in the hundreds, and got the real doctor thing out of my system, at least for a while. I was ready to move to Cambridge. What a shrinky place. I loved it. The People's Republic of Cambridge, as we called it, offered a nonpareil combination of intense psychodynamic psychiatry and equally intense community psychiatry. A resident like me could just as easily be treating a Harvard undergrad as a first-generation Portuguese American. Cambridge Hospital had the Victims of Violence program, and under the influence of Judith Herman's vaunted trauma and recovery approach, which was published right around the time I was there, I realized 2 things. I preferred working with adults with childhood histories of abuse or neglect than actual children, and I wanted to be a father, not a pediatrician. 3.5 years on the couch of a training analyst for the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute helped me figure that out. By the way, this is Freud's couch. You probably recognize it. But then the real doctor itch erupted yet again. I scratched it with a CL fellowship at Brigham and Women's Hospital. The year began with my finally getting the gumption to pierce my ear. I'm fundamentally a shy person. It took an inciting event. Suffice it to say that the service chief told me I would have to wear a white coat. Remember, I mentioned the People's Republic of Cambridge. I declared that I had never worn a white coat, and I was not going to start now. I didn't need a white coat to hold my physicianly authority. She said I had to, so I showed her. The night before starting fellowship, 35 years old, I went to one of those shopping mall piercing places and showed up for my first day of duty with a white coat and a gold stud in my earlobe. I took it out for the years I was in the military because that was a requirement, and I put it back in when I came to Mayo, and it's still there. That fellowship year, I saw more than 1,000 consults, and I wrote my first academic publication, a case report on HIV Munchausen's. And our twins, Hannah and Gabriel, long awaited, were born. The fellowship not only made me a dad, but also provided the bitter material for an article in Academic Medicine on taking a paternity leave in medicine. I did not have a good experience. Before publishing it, it seemed only right to share it with the chair of the department, Jonathan Boris, who was furious I had written it, but then grabbed it from me, took it into his office, and started making suggestions about how to make it better. After the Brigham, I had to repay the Air Force. I was assigned to a training center, Wilford Hall Medical Center at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. At Wilford Hall, I drank a lot of Dunkin' Donuts coffee. There was a shop right outside the main gate, and it reminded me of Boston and helped me pretend I wasn't really in Texas. I met visiting professors like Catherine Zerbe, a psychoanalyst now in Portland, Oregon, who turned me on to using PowerPoints of art masterpieces only to teach psychiatric concepts, meaning she uses just art to give her talk. And I also met Ned Kassem, a former Academy president and MGH-CL leader. Ned got his kicks when he came to Lackland by firing big guns on a military shooting range and scandalizing Air Force officers by theatrically cursing God, remember he's a priest, with expertly deployed four-letter words. It was the era of don't ask, don't tell, the Clinton-era policy that forced LGBTQ troops to grapple with conflicting desires, the desire to serve their country versus the desire to express their sexuality. In my office, they were free to tell, and one of my very favorite patients, who I saw for about 4 years, was in fact an F-16 fighter pilot. I got my start doing psychotherapy with LGBTQ patients. I began working with my first transgender patient. The military asked me to find her crazy, and I could not find her crazy. So she was the first allowed to retire as a transgender person. I continue to enjoy treating this population to this day. It had not dawned upon me that my destiny was to become an academic psychiatrist until Connie pointed out the obvious. When it came time to find a post-military job, Kem Philbrick, my former chair at Wilford Hall, recruited me to the Mayo Clinic. Though I'd barely lived in the Midwest growing up, I felt a gut-level connection with Minnesotans who acted like various versions of my relatives. I've been at Mayo since 1998, writing, teaching, and seeing patients. 7 years ago, I became Mayo Medical School's first admissions dean. I feel a kindred spirit with Dr. Holland, the weary dean of Jefferson Medical College, portrayed in his teaching robes in this 1899 portrait by Thomas Eakins, my favorite painter. I also include Eakins' Thinker because I love this painting and its gangliness. It reminds me a little of myself, and because once I got to stand next to it when my art history class took a field trip to a vault at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. That was a real thrill. By the way, thanks to Madeline Becker, I had the thrill a year ago giving grand rounds at Jefferson Medical College. My hero Eakins studied anatomy there and painted a huge work that graces the cover of many surgical textbooks, The Gross Clinic. In this reproduction, you may well recognize this famous painting. I now offer you a musical interlude so that you get a break from my words and have a chance to hear me play the clarinet. This is about a 3-minute excerpt from the first movement of the Beethoven Quintet for Piano and Woodwinds. The bassoonist is a National Symphony member, and the other 4 musicians are Mayo employees, myself included. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed that. I owe the foundation of my research career to a fourth-degree Tom Hackett connection through a former winner of this award I now consider one of my dearest friends. A bit more history. It was 1986. I was a senior medical student at Brown. Connie and I, 1 degree, were invited to a dinner party in Boston by psychiatrist Jonathan Worth, who had been Connie's cadaver mate in Gross Anatomy back in Hawaii. 2 degrees. Jonathan invited Jim Rundell to the party. 3 degrees. Jonathan and Jim were Consultation-Liaison fellows together at Massachusetts General Hospital under, you guessed it, Tom Hackett. 4 degrees. A few years later, when I was a CL fellow myself, Jim called me out of the blue and asked if I'd like to write a chapter for the inaugural edition he and Tom Wise were editing of the APA textbook of Consultation-Liaison Psychiatry. He gave me a choice of 3 topics: bipolar disorder, endocrine disorders, or suicide. I chose suicide, and the rest, well, the rest is what I'm going to talk about now. Of the 3 options Jim gave me, suicide was the obvious one. Overdetermined, as the analyst would say, even though I didn't make the connection why for years. Since then, I've come to understand the event that I'm going to tell you about is the nidus around which I have consciously and unconsciously organized much of my professional life. 8 days after his 14th birthday, my younger brother, Dougie, hanged himself. I was 16, a senior in high school. No one seemed to know what to say to me. 14-year-olds just didn't commit suicide in those days, and if they did, it was kept secret. I went numb, stoic. My mother's grief so huge that there wasn't room for my own, if I had even been able to access it at all. A day after Dougie's funeral, I had my Harvard interviewer. I told the interviewer I might be a little distracted. My brother had just died. He appeared not to register what I had just said. "What's your grade point average? How about your SAT scores?" he asked. "What else do you have to say for yourself?" For the next half hour, I babbled on about my clarinet playing until the interview finally, mercifully came to an end. Harvard accepted me. I didn't feel safe going there. I ended up going to Yale. 15 years later, as a psychiatry resident at Cambridge, my first outpatient was Nick, a scruffy man in his 40s, perpetually on the edge of homelessness. I got to know Nick as an inpatient. He had been raised in a cult, separated from his parents, and molested as an adolescent by adult cult members. He had at least a depressive disorder, possibly bipolar, or maybe even a diagnosis in the psychotic spectrum. Sexually, he was aroused only by pre-surgical trans women he hooked up with in Boston's old combat zone in a bar that catered to men of his ilk. This is a corner in the combat zone. He was a falling down drunk kind of alcoholic, and when he was intoxicated, he became suicidal. My supervisors warned me not to take Nick on as an outpatient. I ignored them, besotted as I was with my impossible patient, naively believing I could save him from himself. Nick had a habit of getting drunk and coming to the inpatient unit. Stinking of booze, slurring his words, weeping pathetically, he'd lurch off the elevator, announce he wanted to kill himself, and ask for me. Afterwards, he would have no memory of these episodes. When he was sober, he didn't bother to show up for appointments. Needless to say, The therapy did not go well. In one of those early training moments when the countertransference light bulb switches on for the first time, I realized I'd been attracted to Nick's case because, except for the fetish, every diagnosis he had, a member of my immediate family also had. Was I an empath or a fool? How could I be a blank slate for such a man? Would it be best to avoid patients carrying the diagnoses I had grown up with? Would it be best to sequester myself from them? But how can you be a psychiatrist if you can't, or won't, see patients with affective illness, psychosis, childhood trauma, drug and alcohol issues, or suicidality? I got lots of supervision, learned to manage my countertransference, signed on for psychotherapy myself, and learned how to lean in appropriately, using myself and my experience as tools rather than off-limits barriers. I developed a reputation at Cambridge for writing very long notes and being attracted to patients like Nick no one else liked very much. I had just planted my first perennial flower garden. I drove colleagues slightly bananas with an overflowing cornucopia of floral metaphors and vegetal similes. This is my current garden in Minnesota about 2 weeks ago. I planted everything in it. And this is my garden in Minnesota 3 days ago. How quickly the seasons change. At the inpatient unit Christmas party, the unit chief, Greg Clark, presented me with gifts that neatly captured the voluminous notes, the avid gardening, and the unlikable patients. The first was a garden trowel with a ballpoint pen embedded in its handle. The second was a handbook of common weeds. They thought my patients were common weeds. Over the last 20 years, I've presented dozens of times at annual meetings in every format, from paper sessions to workshops, symposias, and plenaries. I felt validated for my deep commitment to education when I received the Studemeyer Award for a teaching model I created for first-year medical students. And some of you may remember Alan Studemeyer, a giant in our field. The model uses live interviews, videotapes, skits, and experiential learning to show these first-year students how medical treatment disrupts normal development, even as it saves lives. And this is my poster for that meeting. A peak experience and a lot of worthy work, hats off to James Walker this time, was serving as Linda Worley's scientific program chair for the 2014 Fort Lauderdale meeting. And there's Jane still smiling. In Linda, I had found a simpatico comrade, a colleague deeply committed to integrating spirituality and the humanities in her conception of CL. Neither one of us can remember where this picture was taken, but I think what's in the bottle is hard cider. The year of her meeting, we even brought an amateur theater company from Mayo to perform Wit, the play about someone dying of cancer. And I'm very grateful for Sandy Rackley, who kept me organized and on task so that I could be organized and on task for Linda. One day soon, I hope we'll be reading Linda's book, using nautical metaphors to help us combat burnout and achieve her trademark, smooth sailing life. I want to tell you about some of my own research. In writing that review chapter for Jim and updating it twice for later editions under Jim Levinson, I came across a number of dogmatisms about suicide I'll call things we knew were true. They didn't make sense to me, and even though I was never the smartest medical student in the class, I am persistent, and I have learned to trust my nose when I smell an academic rat. Proving my contrarian hunch is correct has inspired 25 years of epidemiological projects. I'm delighted to say that on almost all of them, my collaborators have been trainees or junior faculty. Synergy from working with eager, talented, younger colleagues has allowed me to carry out important work I would have otherwise had neither the inclination nor the resources to do. At Academy meetings, we have presented versions of all of these projects I'm now going to summarize. But first, I also had the pleasure of presenting these findings to the Royal College of Psychiatry Consultation-Liaison section in London in 2019. I was there on behalf of the Academy. You'll recognize James Vrack, my genial host for a quintessentially British experience that he arranged for me, high tea at Fortnum and Mason's at the Royal Exchange. So without further ado, on to the studies. We knew that 15% of depressed patients die by suicide, At the kitchen table after my toddler twins were asleep, I began a meta-analysis before I even knew what a meta-analysis was. 500 papers boiled down to 25 that met my strict inclusion criteria. I found a hierarchy ranging from 9% for those patients hospitalized with suicidal ideation or behavior, dropping all the way off to 2% for outpatients and 0.5% for the general non-psychiatric population, a far cry from 15%. This study appeared in the Green Journal in 2000. We knew that 15% of depressed patients die by suicide. At the kitchen table, 10 to 15% of individuals with schizophrenia die by suicide. Brian Palmer, a Mayo Medical student, and I did a meta-analysis concluding that actually only 4.9% die by suicide, and the vast majority of these die within the first 5 years of diagnosis. This study earned Brian a master's degree in public health and appeared in Archives of General Psychiatry in 2005, coming out on the day that he started his residency at Mass General. Okay. We knew that patients with schizophrenia died on average many years earlier than the general population. Ming Swang and colleagues showed us this in 1975 in the Iowa 500 studies, which I sometimes call the 500 Iowa studies, and speculated that suicide was the explanation. We knew that advances in pharmacology and neuroscience had improved the situation for people with schizophrenia. We knew that. Rebecca Capasso, a Mayo Medical student, assembled an Olmsted County cohort of schizophrenics, see Olmsted 319, 30 years later. Even though the general population was living on average several years longer, we found no change in the average age of death for schizophrenics who were dying earlier, likely from cardiovascular diseases and suicide. So we were wrong. The study appeared in Schizophrenia Research in 2008. We knew that most patients dying by suicide visit a doctor in the year before death, the implication being that doctors should be able to detect suicidality and prevent it from being acted upon. I worked with Megan Chalk and Tanner Bommersbach, both Mayo Medical students, on a pair of case control studies in the Rochester Epidemiology Project that showed no difference between cases and controls in terms of having visited a doctor. Doctors asked about suicidality less than half the time, sometimes more for psychiatric patients, but even when they did, only a quarter of suicide decedents ever endorsed suicidality at one of those appointments, and none, not a single one, did so in the final appointment before they killed themselves. These studies appeared in Mayo Clinic Proceedings in 2015 and 2018. We knew that a history of having attempted suicide is the most robust predictor of eventual suicide. With Mayo Medical student Chaitanya Pabadi and junior faculty Alistair McKean, we identified 1,490 individuals making a first suicide attempt coming to medical attention in their lifetime. 81, or 5.5%, died by suicide. What we did that was novel was to include the 48 of the 81 who succeeded on that initial attempt and ended up on the coroner's slab rather than the emergency department. These people who died in that first attempt have been left out of all previous studies, and fully 60% of them did die on the first attempt, with an odds ratio for guns of 130 against all other methods. Since only 33 died on a subsequent attempt, the rate paradoxically dropped for those surviving first attempts. In the subset of those less than 25 years old, 900 subjects, we found the death rate on the first attempt to be even higher at 71%, with 85% of these young people shooting themselves. Both papers underscore the critical importance of primary prevention in preventing suicide. These papers appeared in the Green Journal in 2016 and the Orange Journal in 2018. In a more conceptual vein, Lou Cohen and I recognized that we had a common interest in studying end-of-life ethics and decision-making. We formulated a model that allows various phenomena labeled suicide to be distinguished from one another based on whether an individual intended to hasten death and whether they collaborated with anyone else in making the decision to die. The idea behind this project had to do with consults on the CL service in which all sorts of things are called suicide, most of which do not turn out to be. We created a foursquare to illustrate this, and our paper differentiating suicides from life-ending acts and end-of-life decisions appeared in Psychosomatics in 2009. While we were working on that project, Lou, sometimes with his wife Joan, and I began a tradition of dining together at a nice restaurant one evening during the annual meeting. One more thing I'm missing this year, Lou. Here we are at a Persian restaurant last year in San Diego. Lou has since published 2 books and is deep into a third, each in some way related to end-of-life controversies about extending or foreshortening life. Pondering the lower left-hand corner of the square, the part that had to do with hospice and palliative care, the one in which there's collaboration extensively but no desire to hasten death, I dreamed up a model that proposes the third stage between life and death, what I named coda de vida. Coda is, of course, a musical term, back to the humanities, for a tale on a classical era symphony in which themes are reprised at the end of the piece in truncated versions of themselves. My coda refers to the indeterminate space technology creates, in which we can keep failing bodies going, sometimes indefinitely, with dialysis, ICDs, LVADs, organ transplants, and other technological fixes. The patients who inhabit these augmented bodies may feel like shadows of their former selves, but they formerly would be already dead. Is this a gift or a curse? Heaven or hell or something altogether different? Becca Brendel, nationally recognized for her bioethics expertise, has done a lot of thinking about this idea of coda with me. We've got to get that paper done and published, Becca. I also owe a debt of intellectual gratitude to Linda Ganzini, whose 25 years of thinking and writing about medical assistance and dying in Oregon has influenced my work. Plus, in one of those very strange twists of fate, she just happens to have been my wife's, Connie's, roommate at Yale. And the first thing she always asks Linda when we bump into each other at ACLP is, "How's Connie?" I didn't expect I'd be drawing upon each of these models to help me make sense of my father's decision in 2014 to stop eating and drinking. He was faced with the impossibility of recovering after he had a septic knee replaced against his wishes in the context of an inoperable leaking abdominal aortic aneurysm. My siblings and I had to persuade the nursing home doctor, whom he just barely met, to desist from force feeding him and allow him to succumb peacefully as it became clearer and clearer he would never be able to rehabilitate. He was the same age as Dave, the father of my nursery school friend, also an Air Force officer, when he died. Dying of pancreatic cancer, Dave elected to shoot himself in the head rather than subject himself to care from the doctors he hated for the 6 weeks he'd been given to live. I have paired these 2 cases in Academy workshops, the deaths of Jim and Dave, both 81 when they died, to explore with actual patients how these models of suicide and end-of-life decision-making may have both immediate and broader relevance. I have yet another example of spinning academic gold from the dross of private life. You may recall the infamous Orlando debate 2 years ago on the pros and cons of medical marijuana with Joji Suzuki and Alana Braun, in which I did an infamous striptease. I may know how to dress like a stoner, or at least a caricature of one, and believe it or not, I only dreamed this idea up 20 minutes before the debate and just grabbed things I had in my room. I am, however, always surprised when people who don't know me very well assume I live life in a perpetually altered state. Anything but. I came to be a medical marijuana expert in an effort to make sense of what was happening with my 17-year-old son. Connie and I were permissive parents until we weren't. As the smell of burning weed wafted up from the basement, we wanted to believe our son was just experimenting with it, and it was safer for him and his friends to do it at home than elsewhere. When Gabe overdosed, we were done once and for all with permissiveness. We forced him, fighting us every inch of the way, into treatment that he didn't want. He was still a minor, and we could force him. Using my best intellectual defenses, I set out to submerge my grief in a good academic project that used myself, but also got beyond myself. You remember my reputation for writing long notes. The result of my research was Blurred Boundaries, the Therapeutics and Politics of Medical Marijuana, 10,000 words on the fuzzy distinction between medical and recreational use that ran in Mayo Clinic proceedings in 2012. As many of you know, that's a huge number of words for a medical journal. But my friend and proceedings editor, Bill Lanier, said that was the number of words it needed to be so he was going to run it at length. As a result of that piece, I became an unwitting pundit and ended up writing a pro piece for the New England Journal on medical marijuana use in an elderly woman with breast cancer metastases in whom other treatments had failed. I told the New England Journal editors I could write the pro or the con and say more or less the same thing. Blurred boundaries indeed. Jane Brody, New York Times health writer, interviewed me for her column. I debated Richard DuPont, Richard Nixon's drug czar, on all things considered. When Blurred Boundaries was about to be published, I asked Gabe if I could dedicate the piece to him. Sure, Dad, he said, laughing. I asked him what it was so funny, and he said, Dad, the problem was never weed. It was pills and alcohol. What did I know? I'm proud of him and grateful for his 10 years of sobriety and counting. It would have been challenging enough to give this talk in person. Having attended every Hackett lecture for the past 25 years, I have seen how emotionally overwhelming it can be to stand up on that stage before 1,000 friends and colleagues and try to remain composed and coherent while waxing eloquent about what the Academy has meant to you. I have witnessed the well-wishers rushing the stage at the end of the talk and enveloping the speaker in handshakes and hugs in what undeniably represents the apex of an ACLP career. These are my family, by the way. On the left, we have my wife, Connie, and Gabe and Hannah. And then on the right, we have me and my mother standing in the garden. In springtime in Minnesota, she loves to come and weed dandelions, and she's 85 in this picture. ACLP has been my academic home. As the swallows reliably return to Capistrano each year, so do ACLP members resolutely flock to the annual meeting each November. I have been, and will continue to be for as long as I can be, one of those ACLP swallows, even as Connie remonstrates that I have reliably missed her November 14th birthday nearly every year for the last 25 because of ACLP. Connie, I'll be home for your birthday this pandemic year, but I have to tell you that ACLP is a compelling mistress. I also have to ask you, what happens to the swallows if there is no mission? What becomes of us without our annual meeting? What is my fate as I tape this celebratory lecture alone so that it can be broadcast into the ether? What will it be like to watch myself live streamed rather than be myself incarnate when the time comes to give this presentation? In closing, I want to thank the Academy for bestowing this greatest of honors upon me. I am humbled beyond knowing. But in this time of COVID time of isolation, I do have a request. In preparing and presenting this talk, I've had to have faith that you are out there. I do love mail and getting mail. So please, if you are so inclined, if you can see clear to do so, send me your handshakes and hugs in an email, or even better yet, a snail mail note, letting me know that you're out there. It will mean the world to me. Thank you.